Acabou que é nosso também, né?
Quer botar meu fone no computador? Lá, 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 lá. Lá, 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 lá. Espera que eu vou cantar uma Whitney Houston. And I will always love you.
Onde é a galera olhando pro evento?
Tu tá pegando lá?
Tá muito alto?
Tem que deixar apoiado.
Ei, som. Ei, som.
Deixa assim.
Pede pra enrolar e você quer ficar mais assim.
difícil mesmo pronunciar o nome do técnico ali da VH. Tem um nome exótico.
In democratic innovation, Latin America, participation, representation, and social control, and the horizon of politics, emerging issues, and agendas for research. Welcome, Professor Adrian. And then the third speaker this morning will be Professor Luciana Tatagiba. She's Professor in the Department of Political Science of UNICAMP, who does research on participatory democracy, social movements, and collective action. She has more than a dozen articles published in important Brazilian and international journals, and in 2014 she did a postdoctorate at the International Center for Participation Studies in England, discussing specifically the relationship between state and society, above all in the period of President Lula, and she has a doctorate thesis that received the award from CAPES. Well, good morning. First of all, I would like to thank for the invitation to be able to participate in this event, which really intends to contribute to the debate and production of new ideas and think about new challenges about the topic of democracy. And I'd like to greet my colleagues Emil, Marcelo, Adrian, Luciana, and other colleagues from the University of Sao Paulo also. And actually we talked a little bit, that's why we changed the order of the presentation, because we initially had thought about the possibility of speaking part, each of us, but it would have been difficult. So we did a certain division, and so I began trying to discuss an overview of the process of democratic construction of Brazil recently, especially the construction of the known participatory institutions, and think about a few theoretical aspects regarding democratic theory in this sense. Adrian is going to talk also, both Adrian and Luciana are going to talk about these things, possibly focusing more, in the case of Adrian, to institutionalization, the trajectory of institutionalization of civil society, a good part through the institutions and perspectives, and Luciana focusing mostly on cycles of protests and mass demonstrations in Brazil in these last decades. Well, I prepared a small text to make things easier for the translation. I'll try to follow this. The title is Participation and Representation in Democratic Theory in Contemporary Brazil. And what about protest and contestation? Actually, the idea is to think about issues that have new inflections and theoretical perspectives and have been developed in Brazil, obviously from the Brazilian experience in critical dialogue with international literature, and try to bring back some elements of this dialogue, but also to somehow bring to the surface a few possible impacts of the protests, especially the cycle of protests in June 2013 in Brazil, and to what extent this cycle intersects with a theoretical trajectory and brings possibilities to advance in a debate on democracy in the country. Well, so the idea is mainly to present a short overview about development and a dialogue with social movements and regarding democratic innovations, and beginning with the text. I'm going to begin reading now. Two events can be pointed out as important markers in a period that goes from the 1980s to the current time. Think about the Brazilian reality. The first event concerns social mobilizations in the years of 1983 and 1984, known as the movement for direct elections immediately, which gathered more than 1,500,000 people at the Praça da Sé, São Paulo in April 84, representing one of the greatest mobilizations in the history of Brazil, led by political parties that fought for the return of democracy in the country. The second event were the demonstrations of June 2013, which marked a new wave of protests, this time independent of political parties, and although they began because the increase of the price of transport were characterized by plurality of topics on contestation. We may think that the occurrence and the distances between these two events, that of 1984 and 13, after 30 years, therefore help reveal the changes in the trajectories of social movements and democracy and participation in Brazil. As has already been explored very emphatically by the literature, the decade of the 80s, which marked the process, the transition of Brazil, the context of democratization, was extremely fruitful as regards the emergence of new subjects, political and social, who established participation as the central axis in the scene of debates and disputes about democracy in Brazil. One can emphasize popular participation, which had its main inspiration in authors such as Paulo Freire, at the base of the theology of liberation and the formation of the base ecclesial communities, which were spread throughout the country, especially in the previous decade, that is in the 1970s. Also, the emergence in the public sphere of Brazil of important social movements such as the landless people movement, the movement for urban reform, the feminist movement, the environmentalist movement, the movement for racial equality, and others, many of them beginning in periods before the 1980s, culminating with the Constitution of 1988 and the victory of the Workers' Party, the PT, in some cities. The country was to see in this context, in the 80s, the development of a participatory experimentalism, which found its most complex and daring aspect in participatory budget of Porto Alegre. On the other hand, and as a result of the deployment of movements and political articulations of various actors and sectors, mainly in the field of health, a new participatory institutionality was created in the country, materialized in the form of management councils, and was created mainly during the 90s, based on the regulation of public policies in the different social fields. The expansion of experience of participatory budgets and the institutionalization of the councils of managers on different topics throughout the Brazilian territory made this country a sort of laboratory for participatory dynamics and processes, including thousands of councillors and or delegates who in different ways and degrees began to debate and deliberate about policies in the field of health, different areas of public policies, health, social work, education, urban policy, and so on, depending on each sector and social context. Well, this this process of building several channels for institutional participation, or this institutional channeling of participatory requirements of civil society, had a certain impact on the academic profession in social sciences. And in good measure, based on a reduction in studies on the topic of social movements, as opposed to the theoretical development which mobilized this alternative theories of democracy. It is from this perspective that the model of participatory democracy found in these experiences fertile soil to develop, as shown by various studies developed in the country. After all, we are looking at a process, except for all specificities of different contexts, both on national and on the level of the different subnational spheres, approaches a set of assumptions of the participatory democratic theory include these three assumptions, which will be mobilized for the study of these new institutions in Brazil. The first is the assumption of this democratic line that questions the model of representative liberal democracy or elitist democracy as an arrangement or method to choose the political leaders, and which reserves the political sphere to the spaces and actors who have political activity through the authorization given by the electoral process. So there really is an important criticism against the limits of representative democracy and the emphasis on diminished participation. Then the recovery of ideals of inclusion and political equality with a focus on participation extended to different spheres and social sectors, following the premise that female and male citizens are at the same time the formulators and the followers of their own laws. And finally, emphasis on the pedagogical character of participation. Through this theoretical reading, the new participatory institutions would reveal further study of democracy, either because they allow an effective solution of problems and concrete needs now announced by the citizens affected themselves, or by the possibility of providing greater equality, basically because they incorporate the sectors of the population that are more impoverished and excluded from the processes of political decision, or also because they irrigate pedagogical processes with political formation. As regards the social movements, the literature has shown how these participatory institutions have incorporated to a good extent the different sectors, not all sectors obviously, but major sectors of social movements that were actually agents and important actors of the construction of their own participatory demands. This incorporation in some cases took questions about the choices between institutionalization and non-institutionalization, which can be expressed by the equation of autonomy versus co-optation. The growth then, and in the years 2000, and the generalization of participatory institutions over these years also encouraged recovery other theoretical and methodological contributions, especially the line of deliberative democracy, especially based on the mobilization of concepts of civil society and the public sphere. In fact, we will witness a major reading of these institutional and non-institutional spaces and the possible dialogues between them based on the idea of public sphere, be it from the non-state owned one or the formal one or informal one. And here we have the influence of the Habermasian reading for whom, quote, this public sphere can be described as an adequate network for the communication of contents, position-taking, and opinions. There, the communication flows are filtered and synthesized so that they condense in public opinions bundled into specific topics, close quotation. I emphasize this because we're going to show the difficulty of incorporating such complex dynamics as the latest protests in Brazil. So this idea of an interaction with the public sphere is of different sectors which discuss and produce agendas having impact and influence on the sphere of institutional policies. Civil society then appears as the main reservoir of the virtues of a democratic public sphere, also in the sphere, and this reservoir is also important in the sphere of these new institutional spaces. It's not by chance that the concept of civil society has been mobilized, because actually, to a large extent, the norms that are constructed are meant explicitly to incorporate sectors of civil society, organized sectors of civil society, and the privileged agents to occupy these spaces and discuss public policies. One also recovers in this reference the procedural assumptions of deliberative democracy, considering the evaluation of the legitimacy of participatory institutions. So, pluralism, political equality, exchange of arguments, publicity, absence of coercion are raised to important criteria for the evaluation of the deliberative quality of these spaces. Among the dimensions evaluated and followed in different ways, these deliberative assumptions, I would like to point out in the literature, most in studies of the participatory institutions, some dimensions such as the greater or lesser capacity to include different sectors of society, such as major differences and greater capacity of inclusion of the poorer sectors as regards experiments with participatory budget to the detriment of more formal spaces as the managing councils that tend to mobilize and include the middle classes. The differences in resources, whether they be between government and social actors or within the segments themselves, the weight of associativism in civil society in occupying these representation spaces, which has also led to impacts in the composition of this field of social organization, and also on the possibility itself of elitization of the participatory dynamics and the greater inversion, the empowerment of participatory institutions in systems or structures of a broader political power like the legislative institutions and the government bureaucracy. Should be pointed out that differently, or on the contrary, in this debate and in this absorption, this critical absorption regarding the reference, the frame of reference of deliberative democracy, we should point out that this participatory dynamic is very different from controlled experiments of deliberative democracy, such as the deliberative surveys of opinion or many publics. In fact, we are dealing here with practices of real life, and therefore they are part of the political, economic, social and cultural structures according to the text of one of the references to participatory democracy, Kalapatman, about this debate, showing that the frame of reference for deliberation does not manage to lead to evaluating experiences with a participatory budget, which are in fact experience within the social dynamics and not as experiences that are controlled and followed by a number of mechanisms which try to ensure greater efficacy in the control of these assumptions that have been mentioned. So, considering this reality, in which we are trying to introduce the experience of participatory institutions in context marked by social inequalities and hierarchies and power relations, the studies have tried to advance and think about the construction of analytic variables in order to think about the possibility of pointing to ways to overcome limits and obstacles to implementing the democratic ideal of inclusion in democratic deliberation. Among these variables, I'd like to point out interventions, or what one calls a will or political commitment, the impacts and implications of the institutional design, and the trajectory of the associative context or social capital, among others that depend on the model analyzed. Comparative studies provide relief to other dimensions, such as specificities in the field of policies and or their connections with the structures of power on the federal sphere, as I mentioned here. I would also like to give you this brief overview and then present how point out at least 4 dimensions of what has appeared most frequently in more current production and tries to dialogue with the series of participation in democracy and social movements. And of these 4 dimensions, I'd like to include very briefly a few possible results of these protests, especially the demonstrations of June 2013 in Brazil. First, the first issue, first dimension perhaps, which has been developed in the debate on democratic theory that is turned to these institutions and to the sole participatory field, which is a field that has been shown by other studies to incorporate millions of people, thousands and millions of people, especially in conferences on globalization, to hold conferences and so on. So the first important dimension which we have observed, or first displacement of the literature, concerns the approaches between theories of participation and of political representation. Indeed, participatory budgets, councils and conferences have worked mainly through exercising representation. These dynamics have revealed a richer horizon in the phenomenon of political representation, adding to theoretical debate in the field of democracy that tries to broaden the concept of representation, which is based on the requirements of authorization and accountability operationalized by democratic institutions with an electoral base. We should say that these new arguments have been constructed considering the acknowledgement of the democratic importance of different formats, actors and practice of representations in contemporary societies, mainly pointing out those who have deficits in the model of electoral representation to comply with democratic requirement of political inclusion, whether it be by denunciation about the structural limits of the electoral representation model or by the analytic bias based on a diagnosis of the crisis of representative system measured by the conjunction of factors such as political institutional mistrust, political apathy and electoral abstention, and also by recognizing the increased complexity and social plurality. The fact is that the monopoly of the suffrage model of political representation has been challenged in different analytical lines by the pluralization of spaces and actors who perform representation roles outside the traditional political institutions. So the examples of the phenomenon of pluralization of representation are many in the literature, with a constellation of representative practices triggered by individuals, groups and institutions that view to speak or act in the name of other individuals, groups, populations, animals and nature, in most cases independent of having been formally chosen or authorized by the supposed people, elements they represent. In the case of our participatory institutions, despite the important differences between them, we can identify the absence in some cases or the plurality in several others of the requirements for authorization and accountability in these alternative practices. Therefore, and following international debate, the theoretical challenge becomes to try to find other equivalents or criteria which could validate the democratic dimension of these experiences. And we have, in fact, an important contribution by several colleagues at the development of ideas such as virtual representation formulated by Adrian and collaborators, which is found to think about representation as a feeling or commitment to the representee, or the representation by affinity developed by Leonard Alfredson, sort of for case of representation of civil society in institutional spaces. These are examples of what I said. Anyhow, what prevails in these models or representative formats is a major approach, if not a reduction, to the field among the representatives and representees, or those who carry out representative activities and those are represented, all of them part of the organized sectors of society. And from this prospect, there is the first question about the events of 2013. With the groups and associations involved, how can we think about the limits of representativeness regarding a population that is much broader and is not organized? One perceives that the organized ones occupy these spaces and manage to be represented, and then the occurrence of protests outside the traditional channels, both social and institutional, to a certain extent shows this gap between participatory democracy and broad social sectors. So one must advance in a debate on the character and the potential for representation of these spaces. Secondly, and has also been pointed out by the literature, there are a number of advances to rethink the concept of civil society. There was a number of critiques to this concept developed by colleagues who are also present here, including the question about the self-limited concept of civil society, considering the efforts and interests of groups and social movements in participating actively in the different spaces for decision created within the government sphere. Also, with the growing revelation and theoretical approach to relational prospects of civil society and the political institutions. In a critical dialogue with the literature that tends to separate these movements, which will be for contestation from institutionalized policy, these works have begun with a dialogue suggesting different mechanisms and formats and processes for relationship between civil society and the state. In fact, sometimes proposing, in the case of Luciana and collaborators, the idea of a repertory that goes from protest to occupational position in the government. Also, I would like to point out that in addition to the weakness of this concept of civil society, I personally think that the importance is justified, but there has been a development of protests, and how can we incorporate something that's strongly rooted in the more organized sector of societies, and to think about the broad masses that work directly, but that have another social configuration. And I'm going to have to go faster. Well, the third element concerns the idea of public sphere. I think I'm just going to go briefly through to just say that there is also a lot of difficulty in a certain accommodation of manifestations which are formed by another logic which is not that of the traditional social movements, possibly. There's a difficulty of accommodating these two models of democracy that were pointed out, both participatory and deliberative. Different from becoming places for communication, for debate and exchange of arguments informing public opinion. The protests revealed an insurgency of dynamics of contestation which gather together different subjects, different groups of demand which do not talk to each other but instead have conflicts and great differences between the demonstration. And they are political actions which show critics and limits to the system of electoral representation, especially non-recognizing political parties, are also leading to problems and limits of other practices of representation which have their basis in more traditional social organization. This shows a distance with notions of public sphere, formal and informal, as spaces for interaction, communication, exchange, and qualified formation of opinions. Finally, I'd like to call attention to the generation dimension. In fact, research done on the profile of participants in participation institutions also show the important absence of the younger population in these spaces. So this also shows a generation gap. Besides, if on the one hand the youth movements, or certain youth movements, question the relations of power and control of democratic institutions, on the other hand, we also find broad sectors without any ties with associations or collective practices in the social field. So this has to be discussed. Because they deny the representativeness of traditional political actors, or because they inaugurate the political practices through social networks and without the mediation of political and social organizations. The fact is that these new protests have revealed major separations between the traditional political dynamics or the parliaments and the government institutions that are representatives traditionally, or within the participatory institutions found during the last few decades. Finally, going a bit faster, because time is short, I go back to the phase with which I began, which referred to distances not only in time but in purposes, means and resources between the social mobilizations about the elections immediately, direct elections, to value democratic institutions, and the manifestations of June 2013. These last voices of the streets, much more than demanding the offer of public services, vehemently express the distance between a broad part of the population and the democratic institutions, and show the low degree of repercussion of institutions of the participatory democracy. They also showed that contestation on the one hand can begin from other sources or actors who are not necessarily those or actors of social articulations that respond to the conceptual requirements of social movements in the field of social sciences, but also show that the contestation is not necessarily to the defense of political principles, democratic principles anchored in freedom. They can also express anti-democratic principles. So in general, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
We'll give the floor now to Adrian. Let's just wait a few seconds. Okay. Professor Adrian, the floor is yours. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I congratulate the organizers And I hope that this initiative may continue and continue to enable dialogue among us and continues to instigate us to reflect on relevant issues, not only from the theoretical point of view, but also from the point of view of the understanding of the phenomena that challenge us in the transformation of our societies. I thought about the best way to deal with a panel whose challenge was to connect civil society, democracy, and contestation from a Brazilian perspective, or at least raising issues that the transformation in Brazil in the past 30 years has raised to us, researchers, and it has led us to get involved in various debates in the field of theory. I decided, let me just set my timer to police myself. Along the way, I decided to make a presentation with a general argument in trying to interpret some dimensions that seem to me to be crucial to understand the transformations that Brazil went through in the past 30 years and establishing relations between Mexico and Brazil so as to have a counterpoint, a contrast, and in order to show the results of my work in the comparison between these two countries in the past 15 years. I have to run a little, but I'm going to not to pay a little attention to a few slides because initially I had plans to make a presentation of 40 minutes. So I will have to skip a few slides in order to be able to finish in the time so that we have enough time for debate. So the title is the relationship between civil society and democracy, transitions and trajectories of interaction in Brazil and in Mexico. What is the relationship between democracy and civil society? Obviously, in order to think about this relationship, we need to have various assumptions. The first way to deal with this is to answer, well, it depends. The relationship between democracy and civil society depends on the way how we define the terms of the equation, and the way how we define democracy, and on the way how we define civil society, and what we understand by relationship. In each one of these terms, particularly democracy and civil society, usually have normative assumptions in the demarcation of their properties, distinctive properties. So depending on how normative our concepts will be, that will change the understanding or lead us to think about the relationship between democracy and civil society in a different way. This relationship can be conceived in a bi-directional way. Of course, you can think about what is the relationship of democracy to civil society and what is the contribution of civil society to democracy. These are two ways, possibilities of formulating or unfolding this more general question. Very briefly, I would say that the first step to make this question fruitful is ability to avoid tautologies between the terms, and two normative understandings make the terms tautological, because if you define civil society as a good civil society, and if you define democracy as a good society, of course, where there is a good civil society, there will be a good democracy and so forth. So we need to have less definitions that avoid tautologies and that are more restricted from the point of view of their scope. So usually we understand democracy as an institutional framework. The most demanding definitions of democracy do not leave aside the institutional framework. This is an advance of the last 25 years. And which is a result of the experience of dictatorship. We know that the institutional framework is not enough. There are actors, there are practices. I am particularly interested in the political parties as a crucial actors for the operation of democracies. And from the point of view of the normative goals of democracy, regardless of the view, and there are many views that challenge the meaning of democracy, in all of them we find a common background, which is the idea that democracy means self-determination. Self-determination, which can be understood in a merely functional manner. Societies must make decisions. Therefore, democracy allows societies to make binding decisions. Or we can think in a more demanding way. We can think that democracy allows or enables some form of indirect self-determination through channels of representation, Or, in an even more demanding way, we could think that democracy enables us to think about sovereignty if we use a Habermasian style according to which the formation of consensus in the social world moves to the institutions, which allows us to see this process in a certain over time. So concepts developed in society move to institutions. The institutions regulate these concepts, and thus enables us to think about some form of self-determination over time, with a certain development over time. And I want to say we could think in an even more demanding way in form of direct sovereignty, basically through the legislative and the production of norms of universal character, which is a proposal that has a more Republican character. From the point of view of the idea of civil society, we can make our understanding of civil society less demanding. We might say that civil society usually corresponds to what we might call institutions of the societal fabric, which allows society to have a certain social organicity. These institutions have practices, have actors. A set of crucial actors are the associations. Civil society is broader than associations, but for non-trivial reasons, the theory tended to pay special attention to the associations because this is a kind of institutional crystallization of civil society that is peculiarly demanding. It stabilizes the possibilities of action, is more demanding, so associations tend to be a very dear object of the theories of civil society. And the role of civil society from the functional point of view, in general terms, rather than building a good society, is associated to an idea of social differentiation. Civil society produces a process of rationalization of the social, to use Habermasian parlance, or the idea that civil society is the locus of replenishment of a kind of value that cannot be produced neither by the state nor by the market, which is the idea of solidarity. From the point of view of the notion of relationship, usually when one thinks about the relationship between civil society and democracy, we are thinking basically about effects. And the question about the relationship between civil society and democracy tends to be understood as if the effects of civil society, whether these effects are good for democracy and vice versa, whether democracy is good for civil society or whether democracy is a necessary condition for civil society or the other way around, whether an active civil society is a condition for democracy. It's possible to see this relationship not from the point of view of cause and effect, but to see it as any terms of process, and we would tend to think in terms of interactions. My option, my choice is to think this relationship from a point of view of an interaction. There are trajectories, of course. This is an analytical resource to think, to suspend the relationship between state and civil society, either thinking about civil society or democracy. But if we introduce the element of time, this becomes endogenous, and we produce basically a historical process of interactions or historical trajectories. Historical trajectories of mutual constitution between actors and capacities or capabilities, and I would say that specifically in the case of Brazil, compared with other Latin American contexts, what is peculiar is a peculiar trajectory of interactions between actors and institutions that lasts for about 30 years. And it is this trajectory that I want to focus on. I will pay little attention to this slide. If you think about the relationship between civil society and the relationship, the standard arguments tell us that civil society is good for democracy. There are several answers to this, beginning with Tocqueville. Is an antidote against tyranny, or because the social capital of civil society is effective for good governance. It's a neo-Tocquevillian style, or simply because civil society has the role of guaranteeing the vitality of the communication flows, which guarantee or enable the normative promises contained in the modern idea of publicity. So whatever is our view, the standard arguments tend to reinforce that this is a positive relationship. But the empirical research, the critique of these standard arguments has shown that actually civil society is not a synonym of good society. The reject which Putnam, after receiving a generous number of critiques, ended up calling dark side of social capital. There is a dark side of the moon, and one has to take that into account. Negative effects are present, This has been discussed by texts that have become classical, but what is relevant in this assessment is that the effects of civil society on democracy are contingent. The effects of civil society are entirely contingent, which means that we need theories that allow us to understand the contingent effects of civil society on democracy, which implies having theories that enable us to illuminate the diversity of civil society and to understand these effects on the basis of the diversity of civil society and its effects on institutions. There are some attempts along these lines. One of the most successful ones is an attempt by Mark Warren of taking seriously social diversity. We can invert this argument. I'm going to do this here because the argument that I try to pursue in the rest of my talk is what is the relation between democracy and civil society, or whether democracy is good for civil society. Obviously, we have standard arguments. These standard arguments have less diversity because the question seems to be more obvious. We know that when we think about what is the role of democracy from the point of view of its effects on civil society, the answers tell us that civil society offers fundamental rights, and the fundamental rights have the role of stabilizing civil society. Civil society, where civil society enables free association, free communication, freedom of petition, freedom of information, freedom of gathering, and so forth, where various authors are treated in equal terms before the law, and everybody has the equal treatment before the law, equal and fair treatment before the law. Democracy, in this sense, is a necessary condition for the stabilization of civil society. At the same time, a part of democratic theory tells us, and this was mentioned yesterday, very timely by Alessandro, that democracy and market are associated, and just as democracy and market are associated, we know that democracy and pluralism, associative pluralism are also associated. Associative pluralism tends to coincide with democratic context, and these two things are interdependent. It would seem that, in fact, it doesn't make sense to ask whether democracy is beneficial or not for civil society, because most of the arguments tell us that this is a necessary condition. However, we can reframe the question in the following terms. A strong democracy doesn't necessarily produce a strong civil society. I would say that it depends, especially if we look at the context of transition. The answer may vary, and may vary in an unexpected way. If you look at the role of the political parties in the transitions, the trajectories that the political parties play in the transitions can have long-term consequences. I remind here that which Schmitter called paradox of transition. And the paradox of transitions of Schmitter consisted of reminding the actors of civil society that paradoxically, although they had a certain protagonism and a public relevance in the context of dictatorships in democratic contexts, against the expectations, they might lose this central role of this protagonism, and might lose that because other actors in better conditions of monopolizing the social intermediation would occupy these spaces, and these actors are called political parties. So in dictatorial context, it was possible for certain actors to gain notoriety, and these actors might expect that this notoriety would only grow in a democratic context. But Schmitter said that it's precisely the opposite can occur. There is a spatial dimension associated to what he called structures of intermediation, and this means that where you have actors that are able to have a monopolistic representation that monopolize intermediation of social interests vis-à-vis democratic institutions, they tend to be extremely jealous of their roles and their ability of intermediation. As a consequence, these actors can oppose or can strongly inhibit the opening of spaces for new actors. This is a dispute for legitimate intermediation. And from this point of view, if we think about the effects of strong party system, which is a characteristic held by the democratic theory as a characteristic of a healthy democracy, the effects of that on civil society are also contingent. So you can have strong party systems with positive effects, and you can have strong party systems with effects of a strong inhibition on the polarization of actors of civil society and their stabilization. That depends to some degree of effects of interaction. I move then to the second part of my talk, looking at two cases of transition, Mexico and Brazil. The transition in Mexico corresponds to what I might describe as an initial moment which unleashes a trajectory of preservation of the monopoly of social intermediation. The political parties in Mexico preserved very strongly the monopoly of social intermediation. In Mexico, the anomaly, transition is usually associated to an idea of anomaly. There is something that is anomalous, and you have to leave that anomaly behind and to move to a normality, a normal situation. In Mexico, the idea of anomaly, as socially perceived, was very peculiar because although the PRI remained in power for 71 years, the PRI progressively lost spaces in local governments, in state governments, in the Chamber of Deputies, and even in 1988 in the Senate. So that over this 71 years, the PRI began to open space. At the end of this process, it seemed that the only remnant of authoritarianism was the fact that the federal executive remained for 71 years in the hands of the same political party, although there was a certain opening at other levels. In this sense, a fortunate phrase of Vargas Llosa, it was kind of a perfect dictatorship because it was a soft dictatorship instead of a tough dictatorship. After having said that, Vargas Llosa was invited to leave the country by the immigration authorities, so he had to leave the country. But it does have this peculiarity. The Mexican transition in this sense is a long transition of long duration, a long transition. It began, according to most narratives, beginning in 1968. There were movements of middle classes in 1965, big student movement in 1968, which unleashed electoral reform by law Portillo in 1977. And the process of gradual opening led to the stabilization of the picture of political parties beginning in the 1970s. So you have a stabilized political parties, a right-wing, conservative right wing, and then you have a left wing that is present in the electoral field, and the PRI that has an enormous party spectrum. It looks like a Mexican PMDB that we have in Brazil. In 1988, there was a serious possibility of transition that led to a fraud that became known in the whole world, that took the victory from Guatemala Cardinals, but that unleashed process of transition at lower levels. So that political transition in Mexico at the level of municipal level antecedes the transition to federal level. I'm describing a transition in which there is an enormous continuity of the context of political parties, and the relationships between the parties are very solid, because the presence of a hegemonic state party or a state party made it possible that the emergence of people that were clearly against the hegemony of PRI and others that are clearly against it. In this context, the social mobilization in the transition operated according to a model that I might call inverted funnel. What is that? Since the anomaly consisted of taking PRI from the presidents, the social mobilization followed the political parties. The social mobilization of transition in Mexico was a social mobilization basically oriented towards the support of one candidate for the presidency that was capable of defeating the PRI, which is different from what we saw in Brazil. The transition, once occurred, it was excluded at the level of the political party system. There was not a new constitutional pact. There was no new distribution of power. And the post-transition period defined a very peculiar environment for the organizations of civil society. They continue to have a strong orientation toward the political parties, but with very few channels of interaction. The political parties were thankful for the democratic push, but once they got to power, they asked civil society to return back to their home. It had done its job. It was the turn of the political parties to take over national life. There are factors afterwards that reinforce this trajectory. I'm just focusing on the beginning of that trajectory. The transition in Brazil. It is better known, so I'm going to go more briefly, not fast enough. For the interpreters, the Lavalle in Brazil was a dictatorship. In this sense, it corresponds to the Latin American model of transition in most countries, the absence of civil liberties and dictatorship. With one peculiarity, in Brazil, in the dictatorship, there was more political margin than in any other dictatorship in Latin America, because the municipal elections were maintained throughout the dictatorship for all municipalities except for the big cities. And this made a difference because this led to a disorganization of the context of the political parties. What does that mean? Well, a reorganization of the institution of political parties. The Second Republic in Brazil, the First Republic in Brazil, is typically described as a oligarchic political party system. The Second Republic, after the fall of Vargism, progressively began to produce a social and political party identification with labor parties such as PTB, and this progressive social identification with political parties was tumbled by a dictatorship with the imposition of a two-party system, which organized the political dispute between two political parties, ARENA and PMDB. So that a major set of new generations got into the political life, voting in political parties that were new, affiliating themselves to new political party identities. In 1978, because due to the results of the election, the political parties created difficulties for dictatorship, the dictators decided to reorganize the political life, and it allowed the creation of 6 political parties. So you had a framework of this organization of the political parties and of the social identification with them. It's not by chance that Brazil leaves the stage of transition with brand new political parties. In most Latin American countries, the parties that are in government after transition are the parties that are the ones that were frozen during the dictatorship and in return, or political parties that remained all the time during a dictatorial or semi-dictatorial government, such as the Mexican one. In Brazil, we have a new context of political parties, PT and PSDB, and that makes an enormous difference in terms of social mobilization. These new political parties brought a commitment towards the openness to civil society and its participation in the context in which they had not fidelized the political grassroots. This means that the participatory ideal is not only an ideal of PT. It also gained strength through the PMDB party, the first, the Montoro administration and other participatory governments of PMDB also strengthened this idea. And the PSDB, as well as the PT, kept this character, because PT did not have in the past did not have this commitment to participation as it had in the beginning. The idea of participation of PT in the 1980s was the idea of the Soviets, double power. You get to the institutions and you cannot be corrupted by the institutions, so you must have a foot in the institutions and a foot in the social mobilization in order to make sure that you produce democracy. This is the idea of the double power, the idea of participation, but that moves to a different idea of participation, which is a participation that ends up in what we today call participatory institutions. This became possible because PT evolved at the level of municipalities. If PT had won the first election for the presidency, PT probably wouldn't have developed this kind of commitment to participatory institutions. PT created an ideas that have to do with this idea of participation in the course of 1.5 decades. The outcome of the transition in Brazil is a reform of the state and a new institutional space that allowed the political participation of actors of the civil society outside the traditional circuits. Again, there are factors that reinforce this trajectory. I'm just paying attention to the initial moment. I'm going to show very briefly to you a few results and signs of that, indications of that in the beginning of the years 2000 and at the end of the decade of the 2000s. This is a comparison between Mexico City and São Paulo. Always referring to organizations of the civil society. We can see how much these organizations are founded or created by other actors. This is not working. Here. Mexico City, red, São Paulo, blue. Political parties in Mexico are... They create 2/3 less political parties and associations in Brazil. The PRI creates less associations than PMDB. PT creates 3 times more associations than PRD. And if you compare a right-wing party like a PAN, it creates more associations than PSDB in Brazil and PCdoB in Brazil. Then trade unions and a Catholic Church, 32 over against 30%. Civil organizations, almost the same picture. And the only category in which the results in Mexico are higher than the results in Brazil has to do with individuals. So civil society formed by individuals is a civil society that tends to be weaker. Stronger civil societies are societies that mobilize the organized fabric of society. They found organizations, and organizations promotes the creation of new actors. Very briefly, now in terms of budget, if you look at this, look at the global difference between the average budget in annual dollars between Mexico City and São Paulo. 128,000 for São Paulo, $311,000 for Mexico. First Mexico City, then São Paulo. And if you compare local neighborhood associations and community associations in Brazil, they have an average budget of $129 over against $3,000. Organizations of coordination, this is the space of Mexican associations that are connected to trade unions. Again, they are created by political actors and got more political financial support. Does it make a difference in the way these associations relate to political power? So how much do these associations engage with power or dispute with power certain political results? Mexico City and São Paulo. At the federal, state, and local level, the civil society in São Paulo is much more active in terms of demanding things or carrying out specific actions that are aimed at the public power than in the Mexico City. And this applies even to the federal level and to the Mexico City federal capital, which would make it considerably easier for these political actors to aim at the federal power. If you ask the same question about the legislative power, legislative branch, São Paulo pursues much more the legislative power than Mexico City. I have 5 more minutes, and in these 5 minutes I'm going to show very briefly the present picture. Here, just for you to see with what actors and institutions these organizations try to interact the most. Look at the difference in terms of participation channels. 30% in São Paulo over against 7% average. 21% go directly to the executive and 1.1% are directed towards the executive branch in the case of Brazil. So a very different picture. What happened in the last 15 years? This is the evolution of the so-called Management Council of Public Policies in Brazil. The 17 most important ones, this data refers to all municipalities in Brazil in the course of 2 decades. In the beginning of 1988, we practically have no councils, and look at the process of universalization of these councils. You have here 20% of the municipalities with a higher human development index in Brazil than the other ones. So there is a process of expansion in all municipalities. And here I am including 17 different councils into account. If we look at the most important councils, this is the scenario. You can see here there are some high points here. They are induced by the federal level, and we can see them very clearly here. Here I'm just plotting the first period, the last period, and then intermediate periods. Look at the process of expansion of the public policy management councils in the Brazilian municipalities. In the case of health, you have management councils in more than 90% of the municipalities. So the federal induction that you can see is so strong that it can even inhibit the differences between the municipalities by expanding the participation to all municipalities. In other municipalities, the scenario is different. This is a more radical case. This is social welfare. You can see that it's universalized in almost 1 year, the presence of social welfare. Here, I move quickly to the associations. This graph shows that the associations expanded in Brazil in the past 10 years in all municipalities. In each 5-year period. And if you select the associations that are resemble the most what we might call civil society, we can see that these associations are more present in municipalities with a lower human development index. Here the funding, all the slides that I show so far as a result of a research project of mine. This is by Natalia Bueno and Felix Lopez. It's the federal funding directed to organizations of civil society. So there was a substantial growth in the funding over the past 10 years for organizations of civil society. This has not changed. Here we see Mexico. This is a recent result of a research project conducted in 12 states, asking whether organizations in terms of participatory space, 15 years after that. So there is no institutionalization, strong institution that welcomes organizations of civil society. In a recent comparison of last year between systems of democratic control in Mexico as a whole and Brazil as a whole. This is the result of a survey with experts. What we intend to show here is that mechanisms of social control over politics can be quantitatively similar. If you look here, the institutional ones are those that exist as spaces anchored in the law for the participation of civil society, but they do not assume a constant participation or a constitutive participation in this context, as is the case with the management councils. Mixed spaces are the ones in which the actors of civil society do have an institutional role, and from the general point of view, with the exception of protests and so forth, the distribution is relatively similar. But if you look here, how much these devices are articulated with other important devices. In Marxist, these devices are isolated. In Brazil, they do have an articulation with a very broad and larger set of devices. And what kind of bearing do they have on the normativity? It's similar, but on the agenda is 2 times bigger in Brazil. Priority is almost 3 times bigger. On bearing or influence on participation of the citizenship, the difference is also very big. So I'd like to conclude with the last slide. I'm bringing very briefly a very different picture of 2 contexts that are the result of results of 2 very different transition processes. I'm not going to talk about most of the topics of the last slide. I would just like to underline the following. These trajectories are stable trajectories. They obviously are not the end of the story. One issue that changed considerably is that in the last years we have seen mobilizations of civil society that challenge this standard of institutionalization. In which sense do they challenge? In case of Mexico, civil society was mobilized all these years along the lines of political parties. The latest mobilization that you may have seen in Ayotzinapa, mobilizations that cut across the system, So it is the society against the system without a political party orientation. So you have a new phenomenon, a novel phenomenon that is reproduced in a way in Brazil in 2013. But again, the demonstrations make this kind of cut, an anti-system cut. So we have episodes of contestation that have to be thought through more carefully, because they don't fit into this story that I told here, which is a story that looks at the process of strong institutionalization process of organization of civil society, and then you suddenly have on the streets groups of actors that don't seem to fit into that picture. So Luciana is then going to resume the final concept I have mentioned in my presentation.
Tá bem, obrigado, Adrian.
Thank you, Adrian. So we will now have a minute to adapt the media and the places.
Ok, obrigado.
After this presentation by Adrian, I feel a bit intimidated, but all the same, I want to say it's a great pleasure to be here at this event. It's an honor to be in this panel, and as Adrian and Ligia said, we do a certain division of work here, trying to cover the general overview of issues for our debate. And I got the challenge to think about the protests in Brazil and the relationship between democracy and political confrontation, with the main motivation of the protests of June last year, right? That's what I'm bringing here. In 2013, the Brazilian politics was shaken by great mass mobilization, triggered by the increase of tariffs of public transport. The protests of June 2013, which are called the Days of June, for the lack of a better name. If anyone has a better name for it, please present it. Anyhow, the Days of June, those moments when the capacity of intervention of society in politics was broadened, doing away with the fragile uncertainties of routine institutional politics. We don't know clearly what the result is of this protest in June, who won, who lost. What are the impacts on the political imaginary, whether this mobilization will produce reforms, and what will be the direction of these reforms. The cycle is still open, and had another interesting movement in the elections of 2014 was suspense until the last minute. And actually, as in the election of 89, which was one of the most fought over elections of democratic history, it's not by chance. And as in 89, the election for presidency in 2014 was a moment which condensed the energy released by people on the street, was all of its contradictory and multiple facets, was a desire for change. Here I'm going to think about the cycle of June protests based on a strategy that compares June to the two other large mobilizations in Brazilian history, which are the campaign for direct elections immediately in 1984 and the campaign for the impeachment of President Collor in 92. For this I'm going to look at two main issues. The first, what are the innovations and continuities of protests in 2013 compared to the campaigns of 92 and 84? And what do these differences and continuities show us about relations between democracy and contestation, between institutional policy and non-institutional policy in contemporary Brazil? So I'm going to organize my talk about these two issues. First, understand continuities and innovations, and then think about its implications for democracy. My comparison, therefore, will not explore the relations between the cycles. It will also not explore the effects of the protest cycles on the political system. What I'm going to explore here is a way in which the form taken by cycles, that I'm going to try to capture the internal dynamics of these three great mobilizations. Why is this important for me? Because looking at the forum, I can think a bit more systematically about this relationship between institutional and non-institutional policies. Because if the protest cycles are extraordinary moments to suspend the routine political game, the terrain is the daily, everyday politics. It's a routine game in which the mobilized actors seek to influence the institutions. This game that Adrian was referring to just a little while ago. In other words, it's a double direction between protests and common politics. Their routine interactions between movements and institutions mold the internal dynamics of the cycles. And once this has begun, the dynamics of the cycle have an impact on these interactions, opening up space for something new. In other words, in this sense, what I want to say is that we can assume that the great mobilizations can summarize, can synthesize tendencies, can reveal actors and new connections between them, of giving visibility to discourse and counter-discourses that often were constructed over decades but are silenced now. When the big cycles begin, all of this comes to the surface. Everything that was in the submerged networks, as Lucia said, emerges. So the dynamization of internal cycle of protest offers us a great opportunity to identify tendencies that have not been crystallized and which are therefore difficult to understand and often difficult even to give a name to. I think that's the time we are undergoing in Brazil now. We have difficulty in giving a name to what is going on, and this is really evidence of the impact of this new cycle and the construction of our great issues. For this intercycle analysis, I will look at three axis: the symbolic construction of the protest, the infrastructure of mobilization, and the confrontational performances. So I'm going to compare the three cycles of protest based on these three axes. Well, just to refresh your memory and inform our colleagues from abroad who may not be quite informed about these cycles, I will just say what each of them was. The first cycle was in 1984, which was 1/4 direct elections immediately in November 83 and April 84. In the context of the direct elections, thousands of people went on the streets of Tatagiba demanding that National Congress approve the Dente Oliveira amendment, which would allow direct elections of a president. That's our first cycle. That is a return of democracy. The amendment, as we all know, was defeated, and we had to wait till 1988 to be able to vote for the first time for a president after the dictatorship. The second cycle was a campaign for ethics in politics, a movement for ethics in politics in 1992. Between May and December 92, thousands of Brazilians returned to the streets now to require the exit of the first president elected after the return of democracy, Fernando Collor de Mello, who had been involved in the denunciation of corruption. The impeachment of President Collor was approved by the plenary of the parliament. Finally, in June 2013, protesting increased tariffs of public transport, which were limited then to some capitals, and they were nationalized based on the strong police repression against the demonstrators in the city of São Paulo. Protests caused the reduction of tariffs in several cities and continuous point protests and different agendas. Just to give you, just to remind you of what's at stake and what these three cycles are. So let's look at the first axis of a comparison, which is a symbolic construction of protest. What are the words of the mobilization? How did the actors who were on the street define this meaning of the struggle, and what were the banners? All those who analyzed June point out, first of all, the diversity of the claims, of the things they wanted. In the June protests, there were many different banners and mottos. Indignation expressed on the streets had lots of facets. And for the peculiarities of the dynamic of the cycle itself, which I'll go into deeper now, it was not possible to create a symbolic unity around this or a mega frame that could give a meaning to all of this diversity beyond the fact that they didn't want increased tariffs. Not that in the other cases they weren't equally heterogeneous groups on the streets. If we look at the newspapers of those days, you'll see the punks together with Che Guevara T-shirts and home banners and people who lived in better parts of town, just to show that when we look at this, we see a great diversity of groups. Same thing for the impeachment. In these two cases, obviously these were heterogeneous groups with different demands, and they also expressed in the aesthetic of the streets. But both in 84 and in 92, it was possible to create a broad consensus around the banners of ethics and politics and direct elections immediately. And in June, this did not happen. The organization that called for protests in 2013 was a free pass, free ticket movement. The main banner, as I said, was a tariff zero in public transport, first claimed by the students and then extended to a universal demand. And referring to this broader horizon, there was a struggle of the free pass movement against the increased tariffs of public transport in several cities of Brazil. This demand for zero tariff is associated to the agenda of urban reform, urban mobility, in other words, protests against the increased tariffs of public transport also is part of the agenda of changing the city's uses of collective space in the city. It is like collectivization to the left. This movement was linked to the left. Although there was a broader movement, they knew exactly what they wanted when they began the June protests, that the mayor and governor would reduce the tariff that had been increased from 3 reais to 3 reais and 20 centavos. In other words, it was a fight over 20 centavos. They defined from the beginning that as soon as the tariff were reduced, the protest would end. But obviously, MPL did not guide that cycle of protests. The own dynamics of the cycle gave another course to things. From the impeachment onwards, and especially the last decades, with the Workers' Party, there was a set of complaints and repressed wishes that exploded very strongly on the streets in June 2013. Many of these acts seem to be as many as actors prepared to go on the streets, social networks, and the press at large. On the streets, this symbolic dispute exploded in a sea of posters that appeared very emphatically in the press. These two images here comparing the June 2013 to the direct election civility exaggerate and capture these differences. Here, the logic in 2013 was the logic of each person, one poster. It was not that diversity was not present, but look, they had mainly party banners, the yellow of the PMDB and the red of the PT Workers' Party. And here we have another key that we'll have to understand. In June 2013, the trigger was an increased tariff of public transport, but soon we perceived that it wasn't only for 20 cents. Education, health, public transport, urban mobility, FIFA standards, and the people were fighting for access to direct citizens' rights against the oppression of daily oppression. So one of the main things that was not only 20 cents, was for rights, which also appears at a certain moment of the conflict. But But the most interesting aspect, although we had these agendas to which we were certainly used to, things didn't stop here. There were other topics which also indicated the internal diversity of the groups that joined together in the demonstrations. Rejection of PEC, let's say with critique to expenses of the World Cup, end of police violence, reduction of criminal penal majority, defending democracy, defending free or sexual orientation and reproductive rights for abortion, for discriminalization of hashish, against corruption and so on. As the protest expanded, the wish for change and against everything that's there was another motto provoked by the people on the streets against everything that exists. They all metamorphosized into different banners and mottos, and that is what about the symbolic construction of the protest. The second point is the infrastructure of the protest. There are marked differences between the infrastructure of protests when we compare the mobilizations of 84, 92, and 13. The main differences concerned, on the one hand, the displacement of centrality of the parties, and on the other hand, the importance of social networks to mobilize and recruit. And it's very interesting when we look at the internal dynamics of 84 and 92 that we perceive that the structure for mobilization in these two cycles was based on the formation of super-party groups. There was already concern that no political party should capitalize on the protest. But what did they do? It was to agglutinate these parties in the big front. The parties and social movements that were already robust had been strengthened in the fight for democracy, whereas the union movements and students' movement had a super-party front. That was the answer these actors found. As to the parties, they had to mobilize the basic people and offer financial and material support to the protests and lobby in Congress for the approval of the Dante de Oliveira amendment. The presence of strong social movements with social capillarity as the CUT and CNDB reinforced the aggregating meaning of the super party front, which was a main symbolic base of support for the protests. In the case of direct elections at once, all of this organization also had the the committees which mobilized the territories and so on. The infrastructure of mobilization for last June was based on completely different things. The mobilization last year. In the June meetings, the organization that called the protest, as I said, was the Free Pass movement that was present in different specificity since 2004. Other rebellions, revolt as they like to say, are part of the memory of the movement. The one in Florianopolis 2005, the Victoria Teresina once, and the revolt of Porto Alegre 2013, and the one in Goiânia. In other words, the logic of the Free Pass movement was to create revolts, produce protests in the cities around issues involving the increased tariff. Part of the narrative of the movement are also localized actions for everyday resistance against the very bad quality of public services. And it's very interesting in history when the movement tells what it is and how they work. They besides these revolts in the cities, they include the individual act of jumping over the bus barrier and trying not to pay on the bus and so on, which meant to implement in practice zero tariff. And there were a number of things that showed the political meaning of daily humiliations and the importance. In 2013, what happened last year is that PNPL was preparing for another revolt, another of these revolts in the city of São Paulo, but the truculent action of the police led to amplifying the conflict to the entire country. MPL affirms itself as a group with an internal dynamics that was horizontal, without any party connections, although they were left-wing, with an horizontal organizational structure so that there's no president, no leader, no head or secretary. And it's funny that the strength and weakness of MPL is precisely in the profile of the militants, who are young people who say that they do not like institutional politics, such as political parties and the broader idea of dispute for power. A survey by a newspaper in the context of the protests informed that 84% of the young people on the streets in the protests in 2013 did not have any party preference. 84% did not have any party preference. 71% of them participated for the first time in some demonstration. 81% of them got information on the protests from Facebook. And it's very interesting that in these specific protests, the MPL defined that they would not work with the traditional partners, that PSOL, PSTU, PT, which are center-left and far-left parties, and they would also not work with movements such as the homeless workers movement and the metallurgical workers movement, who were the habitual partners because they wanted greater independence. They always had their actions together with these partners, but this time they decided they wanted more flexibility, so they took the decisions alone. What's also interesting in the June meeting for mobilization, that the left parties did not have any directive function. Also, the party left was thrown off the streets. We all know and remember the images of confrontation between militants who carried banners of political parties on the left and social movements. Many of the militants had to throw away their banners or T-shirts to continue protesting, and the newspapers talked about several cases of aggression between the militants, an unheard of level for Muslim standards. Not that in direct elections and impeachment this did not happen. It did happen, but in general they were booing when some candidate appeared, not the banners, but booing when someone came around because of the electoral period and they wanted to capitalize on it. And it's important to remember that in June it was different. There was open hostility. 2013, the anti-party movement, anti-workers movement, showed an ambiguous relationship with a tendency which appears to be to strengthen a new party right. We do not really understand how anti-PT and anti-party movements are associated with this new right, but it's all a very complex corridor. In the absence of traditional political characters with the resources and expertise for collective actions, the role of mobilizing and recruiting the protests were carried out mainly by the social networks. I'm not saying that the cycle of June protest was built in the social networks, but they had an important role. We can talk about it later. But for confrontation, performance, just briefly, I would say, because I've only got 9 minutes to speak still, so that we can come to a conclusion. The campaign for direct elections, the party meetings were the main aspect of confrontation. How did it happen? You take the newspapers of the time, the narrative invariably was people left points that had been agreed on, generally basically so committees, unions, schools, and went along the streets to a given point. There was a stage with the party leaders, the global television actors, and Fafadi playing all those singers that we remember. And these parties meetings were about 5 hours long speeches by Lula, by Tatagiba, and so on, great political figures, Quers and all these others together. These were large public events. A very interesting analysis compares the reappropriation of traditional political meetings, which were usually in the cities of material, and in the direct election ones, we had a reinvention of these meetings funded by the parties or by governors who were committed to the case. And there was caravans and demonstrations. Anyhow, the movement for ethics in politics, there were also parades, political meetings and meeting Congress. And I don't know whether you remember, things were not so hot, and the president decided to ask all his supporters to go out on a Sunday, on 13th of August, dressing the colors of Brazil, yellow and green. You remember there was a Black Sunday, everyone went out wearing black on the streets, symbolizing the funeral of the president. So colors, words actually worked against him. But also the painted faces were important. Direct elections was political meetings, and in the one for ethics in politics was young people who painted the color of Brazilian flag on their face. So in the 2013 ones, there were similar images of direct election to those of those two others. The mass occupied the center of capitalism in Brazil in parades with joy, and the red banners were mixed with the colors of our flag until a certain point. Then, I'm not going to go into details, but afterwards we can discuss this presence of the national symbols at the protest. I think it's something that we have to think about more, because you say that this only happened in June, but it's very present, and I think there's a dynamics that we can't understand. But anyway, what I'd like to call your attention to is that the similarity of confrontation strategies present in June to the cycles of 84 and 92, and right here, beyond young people on a square occupying Paulista Avenue and having parades and so on, that is where the similarities stop. In June 2013, there were no political meetings, no microphone, no artists or actors to encourage them to demonstrate. When these people joined, they were there as common people. There were no speeches, no support of the mayors or governors. The spaces that demarcated the temporality of events was also different. In direct elections and impeachment, the power of the streets wanted to directly influence the legislative power. After all, in most cases, it was necessary to approve the amendment in Parliament and the request for impeachment too. And this space for the channel conflicts marked the internal dynamics of these two cycles. In June, the timing of the process was completely different, and it followed the decision of the MPL to asphyxiate the executive power with successive demonstrations at short intervals. This strategy, that's what I was going to talk about. About the national flag, we can also talk about it later in the debate. But the decision of the MPL then was to asphyxiate the public power with successive demonstrations at short intervals, and in fact the city stopped. But maybe the main innovation in the June protest compared to the previous cycles was the presence of violent strategies for confrontation. From the first protest, the aesthetics of violence was outstanding on the streets and in the coverage by the press. Fire, depredation, TV stations, cars attacked, attempt to invade the government areas, and open confrontation with the police. And one of the most beautiful images produced in this protest was the occupation of the spaces in National Congress, National Parliament, with that wonderful light and the shadow of the people in the protest, and people in black with their masks were Brazilians were introduced to black box, all of them transmitted by the ninja media and others, and then by the newscasts which suspended their programs to cover the conflict using war metaphors. I'm not going to go deeper into that, but I think we should go back to the role of the relationship between the collective and violence, which we haven't discussed. But so, what happened there? What can we conclude from all of this? I'm going back to our initial questions. What are the innovations and continuities of the June meetings compared to the other two cycles? And what are the differences and continuities, and what do they show us between the democracy, contestation, and institutional and non-institutional politics in contemporary Brazil? First of all, what I would like to suggest here is that the June meetings show that we are in a new cycle of political confrontation. Talking with Adrian and with Ligia, direct elections and impeachment are part of the same cycle of confrontations which began in 1970 in the struggles against the dictatorship and for better living conditions. In this cycle, the actor who repelled the changes was a popular democratic field, the collective actor consisting of an amalgam between popular movements, union movements, left-wing parties, and the Catholic Church. This field and this articulation resulted the new novelties of participation which our colleagues spoke about. Well, the characteristics of the June ones explicitly show that this cycle has ended. This cycle of confrontation that began in 1970 reached its high point in 2002 with the election of Lula as president, and closed in 2010 when Lula left the presidency. And that is what I'd like to place for discussion with you. The cycle that began in the mid-70s ended when Lula left the presidency in 2010. Therefore, we are in a new cycle, which brings marks of unheard of social conflict expressed in the dynamics of the mobilizations in June. What June expresses is a profound radicalization and polarization of Brazilian society, in which parties have looked at as a farce. Well, I just wanted to mention a second element briefly. No, I have to go back. This new cycle of confrontations inaugurated in 2010 questions the social political arrangements that created our democratic institutionality over these 30 years, and questions mainly the gains by successive generations of militants who bet on the key of reform inside the state, inside the institutions. The young people went to the streets were not part of this agreement, and for them, all of this participatory architecture, which was laboriously achieved, does not make much sense. There was a shorter time in politics as a result of the advances achieved in terms of public policies. The streets in June explored the time of waiting and brought urgency. The access to direct rights of citizenship are demanded now. There are two other elements I want to talk, but I'll just mention them and we'll leave them for debate. This was the first. The second is that when we compare the internal dynamics of the three cycles, particularly the symbolic construction of the protest, it becomes clear that there's a process of complexification of the Brazilian society since the campaign of direct elections. There's a number of new actors who have gained strength over these 30 years and who emerge in the public arena requiring, demanding being acknowledged, such as the homosexuals, blacks, the quilombolas, the youth, and in some cases demanding recognition and also compensation by the state. On the other hand, also, because of the Lula government, we certainly had worsening class war because of funding for social policies. And it's interesting to perceive that the poor in Brazil finally appeared in the public arena with their own face and speech. Their main expression is the struggle of peripheral areas against the extermination of black youth, political violence, and policies for access and staying in the city. On the other hand, the same policies of Lula strengthened the C and D classes, which also at the same time have another process in parallel, which is the increased strength of Protestant religions and their conservative appeal, which had a lot of repercussion in the C and D class. So there's a process of increasing the guarantees of individual rights and the process of denial to all this, which appears very clearly here. Well, only another 3 minutes. And finally, the third element that I point out is the crisis of political representation, especially the divorce between the party left and the streets. June quite rendered explicit that the left is no longer on the streets alone as it used to be since the direct election movement. What called attention on analyzing June was the presence of the right demanding space on the streets. And it seems that the right has come to stay because in the 10 years of Lula government there was no great effort for dialogue with these young people, or even to become present in the spaces of political formation and so on. That's it. Thank you. The rest will be under debate.
Thank you very much to the 3 speakers. We now have about 35 minutes for questions, for debate. The floor is open. Those who ask questions, if you ask questions, please use the microphone, both because of the translation, because of the broadcasting. And to those of us who are following this remotely can send their questions, which will be directed to the speakers. Please be brief in your questions. Don't use more than 1 minute or 1.5 minutes. Thank you very much. Thanks for the excellent presentations. I am Vitor. I am a student of this program, doctoral student in sociology in this institution, and my question is directed to Professor Luciana. Let's do basically the whole scenario that was presented, comparison the big mobilizations in the 1980s and 90s and in 2010. The decade of 2010. Basically, I'm referring to the issue that the factor that unleashed the demonstrations was the demand in the area of public transportation. But the question is, in the identification, and this is very well put, there was in 2005 in Florianopolis, there was also a protest in which the movement for the public transportation free of charge was able to stop the alarm. In 2003, there was the revolt of Guzu in Salvador, which had a trajectory of social mobilization. My question is this: in São Paulo, posters were shown and said we are going to repeat Porto Alegre. So here the struggle bloc was able to stop the city, and the mayor changed his decision and did not increase the price of tickets in public transportation, but the idea in São Paulo was the same. In that context of exacerbation of conflicts, police fire around the Ramos Square. I'm from São Paulo, but I live here. And the confrontation with the police, which in fact made people to adhere massively, so it gained the demonstration gained a national dimension. But my question is this: since at the origin the demonstration were complaints about the public transportation, is the representation in which you can identify the nationalization of the conflict as being unleashed in São Paulo, is that not really that symbolically concentrates the flows in this in the center, in the southeastern part of the country? Are we not neglecting the linguistic role played by other cities, perhaps? And that refers us to the issue of symbolic representation. I would also like to raise and ask you a comment about the role of the media that tried to capitalize on that. At the beginning, there was a clear discourse of criminalization. They presented that as being vandals. Analdo Jabor showed a video trying to delegitimize the protest, and there was a semantic turning point in the representation proposed by the media. And then we saw that the number of people who adhered increased as a result of that. But this also reflects something that was not mentioned, which was of the oligopolic groups in the public transportation in the media, and an issue that still, perhaps still reflects, still contains echoes of 2013, is the investigation being carried out by the federal police around the so-called car wash operation, in which that reaches the conglomerates of big construction companies. The private sector has always challenged corrupt people without talking about those who corrupt them. So I'd like to hear your opinion about the oligopolic groups, about the resistance of those groups in opening the black box, the groups that don't want to open up their books, the flow sheets of costs. Just a moment. I think now we should first collect a few questions. I would like you to ask really to be brief and not talk for more than 1 minute or a minute and a half. So it's my turn over here. Now, as I listened to your talks, I could feel very clearly that you were not part of the process. None of the process of construction of demonstrations, and maybe you, Luciana. I was part of it from the very beginning. When you said that the MPL wanted more autonomy, I don't know whether I agree. First, because the MPL movement never needed the other social movements to do anything. They are better articulated with the students' movement, and one should recall that there is a whole scene of activism, just like this music scene in the 1980s. There is a scene of activism. Everybody knows each other. Everybody goes to drink beer together, where the space of administration is also a space of feast and encounter, particularly in a city like São Paulo, where people don't meet. In 2012, when I left here from the event about Durkheim, and I arrived in São Paulo at 6 in the morning. At 7:30 in the morning, I got a call from Rafael asking for help, asking me to run to the square because the police was trying to remove the equipment of a group of São Paulo. I think the effervescence begins right there. That triggered everything that happened in June began there. That act. And the more the police beat, the more the police repressed, the more people got together. At the first act of MPL in São Paulo, the whole left wing was there, all the friends were there, the whole group. At the second one, everybody was there, the whole left wing, the group. At the third one, we were really beaten up. There were 3 helicopters above our heads. So it was symbolic on the Maria Antônia Street, because I know that previously there had been a problem there with police repression. That was symbolic, was at the border between Consolação and Maria Antônia. The police officers began to throw bombs. We tried to respond without violence. But at the next act, the right wing showed up. Until then, we were vandals, when we were just left wing. But at the following act, then this story came up. Let's repeat Porto Alegre, because Porto Alegre was able to reduce the public transformation tariff before. But everybody's articulated. I know the people here in Porto Alegre, in Horizonte. This is a scene where everybody knows each other. Just a comment from within. Professor Donatella had asked for the floor. Eu tenho perguntas para todos, mas eu não sei se eu consigo falar só 2 minutos. Por isso, vou começar com a pergunta que eu tenho a fazer a Luciana. Em uma perspectiva comparativa, eu estava me perguntando, na mídia, na análise, houve uma avaliação de continuidades e descontinuidades em comparação com os movimentos de 2011. Em 2013, não foi só no Brasil, também foi Gezi Parks, foi na Ucrânia. Então, houve vários movimentos. E há algumas continuidades, mas também algumas diferenças. Por exemplo, em 2011, os movimentos eram claramente de esquerda. Em 2013, os movimentos, havia sempre pontos de interrogação em alguns países da Europa Oriental, onde há dificuldades específicas do uso da linguagem de esquerda. Em 2011, era a antiga esquerda, questões tradicionais e justiça social. Em 2013, às vezes, esses grupos foram designados como novos movimentos sociais, Gezi Parks, movimentos ambientais, por exemplo. Em 2011, se tratava de países que estavam em dificuldades econômicas, protestos contra medidas de austeridade. Em 2013, nos países dos BRICS, o Brasil e a Turquia foram exemplos disso. Em 2011 também ocorreu em democracias estabelecidas. Em 2013, em vez disso, às vezes aconteceu em regimes híbridos, às vezes na chamada democradura, para citar a literatura que fala da América Latina. Em 2011, não violência, em 2013, violência. Em 2011, houve pessoas que viviam em situações precárias. Em 2013, houve participantes da Idade Média. Em 2011, anticorrupção, e questões mais gerais. Em 2013, anticorrupção. Eu estava me perguntando se alguma dessas características se enquadra ou se encaixa, corresponde às experiências brasileiras. Tenho tempo para mais uma pergunta? É uma pergunta para Adriano. Para Adriano, eu estava tentando explorar o mesmo tipo de projeto, tentando verificar até que ponto o caminho da democratização, os caminhos da democratização afetam a qualidade da democracia mais tarde, no tempo. Mas eu estou fazendo isso no norte da África e na Europa Oriental. E lá o que eu identifiquei foi o fato de que a democratização com muita participação da sociedade civil produz instituições que são mais abertas. O caminho do pacto participado produziu instituições que tendem a ser mais fechadas, mais baseadas na desmobilização. Porque você apresentou dois casos que são diferentes, em dimensões diferentes. Os dois têm um tipo de pacto. Eu estava me perguntando se também na América Latina a gente poderia encontrar essas diferenças examinando o grau de participação dos movimentos sociais no caminho para a democratização. E a outra pergunta é uma pergunta que eu faço a mim mesma: até que ponto reconhecer a importância do momento da democratização, como é que a gente pode fazer isso sem se tornar determinista demais? Para não dizer tudo começou em 89 ou algo assim. Professor Luciana has a question.
Bem,
Well,
Luciano Fedozzi,
I'm Luciano Fedozzi,
docente do PPGS, trabalho
professor of the Graduate Studies Program. I work on topics of participation in urban issues.
mais especificamente,
More specifically, I work at the Observatory of the Metropolises, big cities. And it's about this topic I'd like to ask a question to the panelists. In general,
levantadas questões,
issues are raised,
talvez como de caráter
issues perhaps of a
estrutural,
infrastructural
diz
character,
respeito a
referring to the
enfim, do,
issue of the political system,
e
and
a outras variáveis
there are other variables
a esse possível
related to this possible background
funcionam hoje
that
essas novas formas de
these new forms of collective action provide today. And it seems to me, just another issue was mentioned by Luciana, which is the
conflitos de classe,
issue of class conflict, social mobility, redistributive policies, and so forth. But one issue seems to me important, which is the urban issue.
parece muito
In other words, this is not, the fact is not enough highlighted. The fact that not only in Brazil, but also in Latin America have been going through an intense process in the last decades, a process of urbanization. And in the case of Brazil, a process of a completely exclusive urbanization. Not totally, but this is a conservative model of urbanization. Not by chance, in June 2013, this took place basically in the big cities. So how do you see a possible relationship between this new context of collective action to democracy and this topic of the model of urban development as something in your view? That's my question. So we will take a final question for this first round. Good morning. Thank you very much. I'm Julieta. I'm from Argentina. Thank you very much to the three panelists for the very interesting talks. I had several questions, but I'm going to select. I was surprised at not finding a mention by you of the mobilizations that were called Relezinho in Brazil. I'm going to explain to our guests from abroad, because I know that from Argentina. These are mobilizations by young people from the peripheries, urban peripheries. They go to the main shopping malls of the cities, of various cities in Brazil, as far as I understood, and which the media, for example, in Argentina, they became very visible, and they were seen with great concern. I would like to see, and this question is directed mainly to Luciana, but perhaps the other ones can also say something about this. What is the place of these mobilizations? Also think about the cycle that you were mentioning. Perhaps you are including also this comparative dimension into this moment. We should perhaps ask whether about this, if they are not included, what are the criteria that we are using in order to define what is a protest by the civil society? If you are thinking about this particular kind of movement, what is your analysis as far as the concept of citizenship is concerned in this process of exclusive urbanization that is also at stake in these organizations? Just perhaps for our discussion in the next sessions, but I kept thinking about the issue of your associations that you mentioned, mainly Adrian and Ligia. Ligia was talking about the protests of 2013, and she said they were not mediated by organizations, mainly political ones. Adrian ended concluded by saying that these protests of 2013 cannot be comprehended or explained by this process of growth of associations that you described. But and Luciana at the same time says that these, what was the name of that association? The Free Pass, Free Public Transportation was a protagonist, at least of the beginning, of those networks, as our young colleague said. So I'm wondering, what is the place of these associations, and what is the growth of this associativism in this movement that is also directed against political parties? So what networks, what relationships are being woven that have to do with the development of associations and of civil society as the place of good politics? Thank you. I would like to very briefly, I agree with Fedossi about in the sense that this urban dimension has been, I think, undervalued in the debates about these new formats of mobilization. We only have to think about not only about the trigger, which is what the issue of public transportation, but also we should think about the choice of the trajectories, the choice of repertoires and procedures that tended, of course, to prevent the circulation in the cities. There was a whole symbolic aspect at stake that tried to show that the city was actually did not belong to everyone, and really should think about this division of our cities. At any rate, I would like just to highlight that, I don't know, this may be a good possibility for analysis, to think about the end of a cycle perhaps, but in the same way as happened with those demonstrations of youth from the periphery in the shopping malls, I think that the protests of 2013 were very contingent depending on the actions and reactions by the public power, by the police. I don't see that as a mobilization of a group or of a articulated set of social movements that had a goal, although the so-called free press, with the exception of the so-called free press, around which there had been a whole decade of mobilization and articulation in terms of a struggle for the space in the city. So the way in which this process was developed in a partly anarchic manner, without centers, without controls, without hierarchies, perhaps this was a very specific moment. So I think it's a little questionable to see these dynamics in this process of action and reaction as the end of a cycle. Perhaps it is the end of a cycle that has shown an important institutional insertion or integration of a associativism generalized. There is a data in Adrian's presentation that I found interesting. He shows how, let me see here, he shows the importance of the funding, of the federal funding for the organizations of civil society. So we have a whole set of articulations and relationships between the organizations that are more traditional and social movements and the governments, which is showing perhaps a renewal, starting with the so-called NPL movement. Perhaps we're seeing an articulation of a group that are active in an anti-institutional arena.
Thank you for the questions. I will reply in Portuguese to be more precise. One of the greatest problems to think about these different trajectories is that, strictly speaking, we do not have any systematic data that will allow us to measure the degree of mobilization and social density in the context of the transitions. And when we look at the literature of Latin America is unanimous in describing vibrant civil society. So if we look at the transitions literature, the consensus in the national literatures in which the civil society is emerging, there are a number of actors with innovative agendas and so on. And in this, it's difficult to distinguish this process because there are two factors at work simultaneously. On the one hand, the entry into the of new categories into the academic field. There's a debate on civil society has sort of replaced the debate on social movements, and you have a displacement of the lens to look at them, and at the same time there is a description in local terms of what is seen as a set of actors who have a set of huge expectations. But comparing is extremely difficult because in all places one says that civil society is extremely innovative, and when we look at the consequences of these innovative civil societies and which have been mobilized, they have very different consequences because in fact the processes after the transitions have the reserved degrees of protagonism that are very different to the different actors of civil society. So there's a methodological problem which is difficult to solve, and a factor that seems important to me, in which literature did not take into account sufficiently, which is what I've tried to do, is to look at the process of interaction between the actors and institutions, and how this produced capacities both from the point of view of institutional actors and actors who are the products of the process. And think that they are products of the process puts us in an analytical key, which is not a traditional one of civil society, thinking about autonomism, but you see that these actors are a product of a very long process of interactions. And when you look at a particular event, you always see the result of a long interaction. Now, how much does one regress in this interaction, that's one of the problems. So transitions are a good moment, a moment that could be described as critical juncture, but the argument about the initial moment has a question of determinism. How do we determinism? I think that these moments are privileged to look at the set of interactions which become very intense and have long-term consequences, but the analysis must follow the new actors and the new conflicts that made the legacy of the first moment a specific use. So the actors who used, opened and rendered effective these institutional occasions are different. There's a big sequence of new actors, new conflicts, new events in Brazil which helped reaffirm a tendency that was initially established in the transition content. And here I couldn't tell the story, but anyhow, the only exit I see is, or what I use is look at the complete process and see what happens over time until the years 2000 to avoid determinism. Luciana, I think that the urban issue is essential to understand our phenomena, and in more than one sense I have perceived that the literature of the 70s basically describes a type of civil society in a context in which we already had urban expansion and the services were in deplorable conditions. We continue to have excluding cities, but the coverage of public services has changed extraordinarily from the 60s to the end of the years 2000. So we have coverages close to 100% of light and water for most of the Brazilian municipalities. The sewage is variable, it goes from 75% to 90-something%, and we can perceive this in the sort of community local actors who are formed. The actors founded in the 60s, 70s have a constant demand of services, and in the 90s and 2000 you don't see any more demand for services as a crucial issue. There are other agendas, and this obliges us to think better. And of exclusion, urban exclusion divisions that we cannot really understand very well and concerns me is the world of crime and informality. This is part of urban governance of our cities. Anyone who goes to the periphery knows that it's part of the governance of crucial issues of the peripheries. And so the sort of analytic look we take at our objects, we did not manage to bring these actors in. They are not at the participatory institutions, they are not in this sort of protest, but they are there, they are governing, they are part of the governance structure of relevant issues in the peripheries, and I'm still trying to think how we can deal with this new cleavage of exclusion that I think has become especially pressing in the last 20 years. And the last question about associations and protests. This trajectory that I described here indeed seems to privilege a set of actors who have a historical trajectory of co-evolution with transition. So these actors that followed the transition process, the actors who followed the history of the Workers' Party, they're not actors who are subordinated to the Workers' Party, but they have institutional and individual biographies connected to it, or they have historical memory connected to the spirit. I interviewed many leaders of associations, and many of them are children of union members who participated in the other one. And these actors have received funds. They have grown and have received funds, but much of these funds are to implement public policies. There are resources that assume management of public policies at the community level and delivering milk, giving milk in the sectoral one, certain projects for assistance, and these resources made it possible to render the civil society feasible. The other civil society that came later and is not in this arrangement. When I remember the debate when the mobilizations were participation with these things, when you see these movements on the street, do you say that democracy is going to be extinct? No, they're selective. They're selecting certain interests and certain actors, and the interests and the actors that select these participatory institutions are not the interests of the actors who are on the street. But they continue to select a broad number of actors and interests, but these new actors and demands will have to build another kind of trajectory to institutionalize them or not. I'm going to add to the issues of something that I think are part of the same dispute in which interpretations about June are involved. At the last meeting of the ABCP, there was a very interesting group on Goiânia, West coming from Goiânia, and they were precisely describing a paper, writing a paper to show that the June protest, the trigger was in Goiânia, and then they said how in Brazil, they said, the subtitle was almost this. They said, for something to happen in Brazil, it has to happen in São Paulo. And that's it. They're quite right. And this is part of this broader field of the disputes. Here it would not be possible to talk about it, but we would have to talk mostly about June, but you can't but you have to begin in 2004 in Salvador with the 2003, see? So anyhow, this is part of the disputes, but you are right, where they want to show that the trigger was there about nationalization, and I joined into your discussion. What was the cleavage to include or not include the small demonstrations? I see about protests that became nationalized and involved many different actors with cycles of confrontation, and this involved not only the children who went to the shopping, but the middle class, the high class, and so on, interclass, intergroup, this mobilizing the concept of cycles of confrontation. And I'll go back to the small the demonstration stuff. What George said, I knew that when I talked about June, I'd be among specialists, and well, this aspect is not my case, but we know that in social sciences, to analyze an object, we do not have to participate directly in it. And this description, I mean, you see the book for 20 cents. It's an interpretation. What does one perceive in your case? I'm going to show a nice militant narrative of one of the interpretations I find in the field about the free pass and its partners. In the case of São Paulo specifically, there was a decision of the free pass group for the June protests. Obviously this was a field of allies, but they wanted to take the decisions about where the demonstrations would begin, what they would do, what road they would take, which they did not manage to control in the end. But there's a lot of native discourse and research involved in what I'm talking about here. Donatella, yes, it would truly be fantastic to understand how these processes fit to the more global aspect. It would be interesting actually to introduce the dynamics of this last cycle based on the previous tendencies that have been discussed more globally. I think that it fits, and I think it's excellent to follow that path. I would also like to return to the case of the rolezinho, which is a small demonstration. No, before this, Victor also had mentioned the issue of corruption. Like the appropriation of national symbols, we have to talk a bit more about corruption. If this topic appears here, it's already present in direct elections, and it was the theme of the impeachment. Congress elected because he said he would hunt the corrupt people. So the topic of corruption is always present in the great demonstration in Brazil, and it will be appropriated, used by the media in different ways, the left and the right. But the topic of criticizing corruption has nothing to do with the right, as was said in June. About the banner that Luciana mentions, it's very dear to me because I study the movement of the homeless since 2008, because I think an important axis of conflict in contemporary societies is the appropriation of urban soil. I think that's a very important base of conflict. Not building the house, because Raquel Rodriguez says it's the ground that's at stake, not the roof. Who does the space of the city goes to? And so on. I think you're right. I think it's an important part of the conflict that might be read according to access and right to the city. Finally, about the issue of rolezinhos, I did not include it here, but it's the capacity of certain actors in Brazilian society who did not have a voice, who did talk about in their own terms. Rolezinho was a clear part. The black and poor people from the periphery already did that. It was the first time that they went in bands to the shopping malls, but now people are really more afraid. People are more afraid because now it's been 15 years that we had the first cultural meeting for music in the periphery. And so the process such as the densification of cultural movements in the periphery, so with hip-hop and so on, which are creating new actors who would speak with their own voice, with their own face, and that has been very frightening. So the rolezinhos are not a cycle, but they certainly make up the profile of this new actor. Ligia, after we talk about the contingent June, because otherwise our time is up, and I would like to ask whether with 55 minutes we can just briefly collect the 4 questions, 2 here, though we won't have more time, 2 there, 2 there, and that one.
Please be very brief. I'm Giovanni, the Graduate Studies Program on Regional Development of the University of Santa Cruz do Sul. You mentioned several elements. The first one is the claim that the right wing is going to the streets. This is perhaps a result of the lack of dialogue on the part of the PT government. Another aspect that you mentioned, that Lavalle mentioned, I'd like to talk a little about the participation. Lavalle said that the political system continues selecting actors and interests, and you also mentioned the plurality of actors and demands or claims that want to have their space and demand compensation for the loss they suffered over time. At the same time, some actors say that the country was democratized, but the structures were kept. So I'd like you to comment a little on how you see the relationship of civil society with the political system the way it is at present. I found very nice that poster that Luciana showed Well, in the demonstration we can see many flags and only a few flags in the other one. This represents the interests of the collectivity and individual represents, for me. Collectivity on the one hand and individuality on the other. So I would like to ask you, shouldn't we perhaps realize that there is lack of space in institutions, lack of space for people to express themselves collectively? Danilo talks about the heterogeneity of the state and of civil society. Perhaps there is no idealism in these spaces institutions where we have, on the contrary, a certain cooptation of interests, and in view of the inequality of resources by the various actors, a situation of disadvantage is created. Perhaps this crisis of banners by the movements and the difficulty of developing a common agenda is an expression of the diversity of political parties. A lack of a clear banner in expressions, and on the part of the politicians we can see that Marina Silva, who is a left-wing candidate, was connected with PT. She helped to found PSOL, and then she moved to a different party. So how are the social movements look at the credibility of the social institutions and at this diversity of political representation? I'm Alessandra, I'm a doctoral student of sociology at this university. My question is to Professor Adrian. I would like to know what considerations should be made about the questions raised by researchers and citizens about the performance of democracy. I ask this question because these questions are motivated by a disenchantment with politics and the politicians. This involves a devaluing of the democratic virtues. Just a brief comment on what Adrian was saying at the end. It has to do with the risk of the myopia of the visible, a so-called myopia of the visible. We participate in a discussion field that for many years has a trend, tends to say that civil society has been completely institutionalized, social movements have shown up, contestation is no longer a relevant issue. We have worked for many years countering them and say that sometimes our eyes are not able to see the dynamics that we have on the streets. What I fear now is that we have the opposite of that. A whole participatory structure and dynamics that was constructed and mobilizes millions of people, I underline millions of people. Suddenly all that seems to disappear under the overwhelming avalanche of protests that took place. So perhaps we should be careful not to lose sight of that complexity of actors and spaces and relationships on the basis because of something visible that imposes itself. I think we have this trend to oscillate according to the fashionable modes, which makes it difficult for us to understand complexity, because a major part of the actors who were on the street also participate in institutional states. So I have a different reading in this interpretive dispute. There are many actors who implement political policies and participate in management councils and was there participating in the demonstration. So we have to be careful again to say this was institutionalization. Contestation is dead now. We have a whole we see only contestation, and the dynamics of institutional participation is no longer important. I think that in Brazil all these processes still have relevance, and this is the complexity that poses a challenge to us. I'm Raquel. I'm a teacher. I would like to refer to what Professor Luciana says, that we are seeing the presence of the right wing on the streets again. So my question is whether it is possible to establish a parallel with the last occasion in which the right wing was on the streets, and whether we can think about the consequence of that for democracy, because it's not only the right wing that is present on the street, but the extreme right wing seems to be organizing again.
Só um instantinho, tem algumas perguntas na internet, tem bastante.
There are lots of questions on the internet, so I would like to know whether you can answer later, just so that you answer later, and we publish this in Twitter, and we look at the page, the event page. I think that what Marcelo said answers the question by our colleague there. I forget your name. Giovanni and Marcelo. I think that the data, one holds on to the data on the profile of the participants in the protest. In fact, I think that no one asked about associative ties, but anyhow, these ties in the case of June 2013 occurs in an individualized form. It was not as members of the NGO such and such or members of feminist movement such and such. It was mainly individual. But I agree with you fully. I think that we have a whole construction, an extremely complex institutional construction that was built with lots of articulations and lots of conflicts, and that this continues. It was present in the sphere of Brazilian democracy, but it doesn't stop. It's all being challenged. Things that there's a need to advance for inclusion and to review institutional parameters. Trying for the question, I'll just go back to an issue that I had not concluded, which was Donatella. If I would have to choose cases with more or less participation, which is something that I forgot to mention, I'd say that Chile and Argentina are more similar to Mexico from the point of view of the effect of the party, the party frame, which is dominant and returned and took over everything in the restricted space for post-transition civil society. So Mexico, Chile, and Argentina would put in a similar register, although they vary, and Brazil and Uruguay put in another register more similar to great changes in the party picture and opening. But these are local narratives, and they will tell you that there was a lot of participation of civil society. Giovanni, I'll just answer briefly using a form of how debate has dealt with equality and capacities inscribed in these new institutions. See, if you look at these institutions from the point of view of your capacity to give the voice to the common citizen, all of the literature would describe this as elitization of participation. Say the institutions do not work because they were not able to receive the common citizen. Basically, they're producing a participatory elite. If you change your lens from participation to representation, the comparison should not be downwards but upwards. And this means that they are more inclusive or less inclusive than other instances of mediation and representation. And when you make this comparison, the councils and all of this institutional framework of participation is a lot more porous and open to social composition, which is more diverse than the council, the city council, the senate, the parliament, and so on. So this process of opening is undeniable. The state has become more porous. It's also undeniable, and it makes it much more complex and possibly difficult to understand the arena where public decisions are made, and there are more interests involved. All of this is very good, but that does not mean that we live in a perfect world. There's a lot more to do, so the problem is not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We have done this, but there's a lot left to do, and I think that this helps answer the question by Alessandra. There are lots of advances, certainly. Brazil, from the point of view of participatory institutions, has a scope and capillarity that are peerless. You will not find something similar in any other context. Conferences, councils, and so on. You can do a survey completely. There are millions of people, there are dozens of millions of councillors, thousands of councillors in the cities that have this. This will not solve a set of problems together. We are improving democracy and making an important contribution that I would call institutional pluralization of democracy, something that was mentioned by Alessandro yesterday, on pluralizing institutions that are part of the traditional of the democratic game where we have to advance further and all criticism make sense. And everything is very satisfactory from the point of view of our understanding how far it works, and I agree with you, Marcel. I wasn't able to pick up the name of the first person. Giovanni. Well, I'd like to mention the point that you talked about the crisis of representation, the logic of each person. The poster shows the crisis of representation. In this sense, I don't know whether it really expresses your counterpoint, whether this would be a collectivization, a collective that goes on the streets, but I think this comes together with strong desire of people to express the world through their own voice. A great desire to talk, so the idea of repressed demands, complaints, accumulated dissatisfactions from several sectors from right to left, progressive or conservative. The Indians were complaining at the time of the Lula government they didn't get any advantage, that they also the environmentalists, and on the other side the more conservative sectors, they come complaining about the advance of the gay agenda and so on. And all the dissatisfactions and demands. I think this double logic, every person, a poster, has a double dimension. One, on the one hand, the crisis of representation in democratic institutions, and on the other hand, this wish to express the world and talk about the world and for the world and to the world by their own voice. I think it's a huge risk of a pendulum, as one said this morning, and how one can cover this complexity. I really agree. About what Raquel asked, I think it's a great challenge, because we're not used to think about the movements of the right in Brazil. I don't remember studies about the right-wing movement, and now our challenge is to think about right, extreme right, and conservatism, conservative thinking, because many actors who were in the June protests were not connected to a party right program. They simply were conservative. In the best Brazilian style, we are conservatives, and Lula perceived this long ago. That's why it is my success. We want changes to not change anything. That's the last issue, Marcelo. Then you said, in fact, there were actors who were on the street that were implementing the politics, but the popular democratic actors were very bothered by the June protests, and they found it very difficult to find their place. It wasn't only the Workers' Party. Those actors were related to the Workers' Party, also did not find their place in the protest. There's a lot of things that fit into the Ligia, finally. What I meant is that June did not generate the end of a cycle. It's the expression of a new cycle. It expresses new dynamic things, actors, and processes about which I think we still find it very difficult to think. Okay, thank you very much. I want to thank Ligia, Adrian, and Luciana, and all of you too for your patience, and thank the people who followed us remotely. And we go back at 2 then. Good lunch.